June 23, 1942. South Wales. A sleek German fighter slices through grey clouds, its engine humming like a predator on the hunt. On the ground, men freeze. The shape, the markings, it's unmistakable. A German warbird, landing on a British airfield. No alarms, no bullets. Just the quiet shock of the impossible. The pilot climbs out, looking at the men in blue uniforms. And suddenly, it hits him. These aren't his comrades, they're the enemy. One small mistake, one wrong turn in the sky, would give the Allies a fighter they had been hunting for months, intact, ready to reveal its secrets. It's a story of chance, confusion, and fate, and how one error changed the course of the war. Watch the full story to see how a single plane became the key to victory. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and support the channel for more incredible World War II stories. It was late afternoon at RAF Pembrey, South Wales. The sky hung low and heavy, the kind of grey that made the horizon disappear. Flight Sergeant Geoffrey L. Berry, the duty officer, was just finishing his tea when he heard it. A roar unlike anything familiar. The airfield vibrated. Mechanics dropped their wrenches, heads turned upward. Out of the clouds, a sleek, shark-like silhouette emerged, fast, low, and menacing. Not a Spitfire, not a Hurricane. This was something else. The plane glided effortlessly across the runway and touched down, its wheels kissing British soil with almost arrogant grace. The guards froze. No one fired. The scene was too strange, too unreal. The aircraft taxied to a stop, its engine idling like a big cat's growl. And then the canopy opened. Out climbed a Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Armin Faber, neat in his grey uniform, Iron Cross gleaming in the dim light. He saluted, expecting a welcome, but instead he was surrounded by men in blue RAF uniforms, their rifles trembling in disbelief. One of them stammered, "Bloody hell, he's one of theirs." Faber looked around, confused. He thought he had landed at a German base in northern France. In reality, he was 200 miles deep in enemy territory. Within minutes, the truth dawned on both sides. A perfectly intact Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's most feared fighter, had just landed itself straight into Allied hands. No shots fired. It was an accident so absurd it felt like fate. And in that moment, as the sun broke weakly through the Welsh clouds, the balance of the air war quietly began to shift. Before that strange day in Wales, the Focke-Wulf 190 was more myth than machine to the Allied pilots who faced it. Rumors spread across air bases like wildfire. Some called it the butcher bird. Others whispered that it could outfly anything the Allies had ever built. And for a time, those whispers felt painfully true. From 1941 onward, the skies over the English Channel became a hunting ground. RAF pilots flying Spitfire. Mark V's, once kings of the air, found themselves suddenly, terrifyingly outmatched. Dogfights that had once been duels of skill now turned into chases for survival. British pilots described it like facing a phantom. It appeared from the sun, struck fast, and vanished before you could even fire back. Its engine growled deeper, its turns were sharper, its dives steeper. It wasn't just faster, it felt alive. It could roll like the devil himself, one pilot later recalled. You could see the shock in his eyes, not anger, not even envy, but awe. The FW-190 wasn't just a new plane. It was a leap in design philosophy. Where the Allies built fighters for elegance and maneuverability, the Germans built the FW-190 for dominance. Under its smooth metal skin lay a 14-cylinder BMW 801D radial engine, delivering over 1,700 horsepower. It climbed like a missile and could hit speeds near 410 miles per hour, faster than any Spitfire at the time. Its wide landing gear gave it perfect stability on takeoff and landing. A small thing, perhaps, but in war, small things save lives. Its thick armor plating protected the pilot from gunfire, and its 4 cannons and 2 machine guns made it a flying fortress of offense. To the men of the RAF, it felt unfair. One pilot wrote in his diary, "It's as if the Luftwaffe have jumped 10 years ahead overnight." They weren't wrong. Every time the FW-190s appeared, the pattern was the same. The German fighters dove from high altitude, fired in devastating bursts, and pulled away before the Spitfires could react. No matter how brave or skilled the Allied pilots were, courage couldn't overcome physics. The Spitfires bled altitude and speed, their engines screaming as they tried to keep up, but couldn't. By late 1941, British morale in the air was slipping. Every encounter with the new German fighter left more questions than answers. Where did it come from? How could it turn like that? What made it so unstoppable? Engineers at Supermarine and Rolls-Royce worked frantically, trying to understand the reports from returning pilots. Sketches, rough descriptions, and combat notes were all they had, pieces of a ghost. The Air Ministry knew they needed one intact FW-190 to study, but no one imagined they would ever get one. The Germans, for their part, guarded the secret jealously. The aircraft was the pride of designer Kurt Tank, who once described it as an eagle among crows. And in the early years of the war, he wasn't wrong. When American pilots joined the fight in 1942, even their P-47 Thunderbolts struggled against the FW-190's speed and roll rate. It wasn't just a machine, it was a psychological weapon. Every Allied pilot who took off knew that somewhere above the clouds, a German butcher bird might be circling, unseen. For the men on the ground, the stories became legend. Pilots told each other, half-jokingly, that if you ever saw an FW-190 up close, it meant you were seconds away from dying. No one dreamed they'd ever walk up to one parked calmly on a British runway. But that's exactly what happened on June 23, 1942. The ghost over the channel, the terror of the RAF, had suddenly appeared not as an enemy in the sky, but as a prize on British soil. Perfect, undamaged, delivered by the enemy himself. The impossible had happened, and the Allied engineers who soon gathered around that silver-gray fighter would realize they were staring not just at a machine, but at the key to reclaiming the skies of Europe. Above the clouds that day, Oberleutnant Armin Faber had been a man in complete control. At 21 years old, he was already an experienced ace, part of the elite Jagdgeschwader. 2. Richthofen, a unit that had carved its name into the skies of Western Europe. He had flown countless sorties, engaged in dozens of dogfights, and survived situations that would have ended lesser pilot. To him, the Focke-Wulf 190 was not just a plane, it was an extension of himself, fast, precise, lethal. The mission that morning had been routine, at least by Luftwaffe standards. Faber and his squadron provided top cover for bombers attacking coastal targets over the English Channel. The Germans had calculated their strikes meticulously. Flight path, timing, altitude, formation, everything choreographed like a deadly ballet. But even in the best planned missions, the sky can turn traitor. During aggressive maneuvers against RAF fighters, Faber lost the coastline. The clouds swallowed landmarks. The sun reflected off the water at deceptive angles, and his instruments, though accurate, couldn't compensate for human perception under stress. He believed he had made a 180-degree turn, circling back over friendly territory in northern France. In truth, he had drifted north, over Wales, miles from home. Faber's mind was a battlefield of assumption. He saw green fields stretching below, dotted with hangars and small airstrips. Every instinct told him, this is home. And so, without hesitation, he began his descent. When he landed, he expected applause from comrades. Instead, the canopy slid back to reveal rifles pointed directly at him. For a moment, time froze. Faber's world, built on precision, skill, and dominance, crumbled into confusion. The irony was almost surreal. A pilot trained to navigate the most chaotic skies had fallen victim to the simplest of errors, misreading the land below. And in doing so, he turned Germany's most advanced fighter into an open book for the enemy. Historians would later note that Faber's mistake was not unique. High-speed aerial combat, combined with extreme G-forces, clouds, and disorientation, had caused many skilled pilots to misjudge positions, but no one imagined such a perfect, intact aircraft would land in the hands of their foes. For Faber, the consequences were immediate. Within minutes, he was surrounded, disarmed, and under escort. British intelligence officers were already moving to examine the plane, their eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and anticipation. Even in captivity, Faber's reputation remained intact among his peers. One Luftwaffe officer later remarked, "Armin did nothing wrong in skill. The skies simply betrayed him." The FW-190 beside him, however, told a different story. Every curve of its fuselage, every glint of its propeller, seemed to taunt the Allies, whispering secrets that had cost hundreds of pilots their lives. But now, for the first time, the veil was lifted. For the men of the RAF, witnessing the pilot and plane together was almost cinematic in its absurdity. A living, breathing German ace, caught not by gunfire or strategy, but by geography and misjudgment, offered a glimpse into both the human and technological aspects of warfare. Faber's story reminds us that even in the most complex conflicts, small human errors can have outsized consequences. A single turn, a misread landmark, a moment of misperception, and the balance of power can shift. And yet, there was a paradox lurking in the shadow of this error. The same man who had lost the sky had unknowingly handed the Allies the very tools to understand and eventually defeat his deadly aircraft. The irony was not lost on anyone watching, nor would it be lost on the generations of historians studying this episode decades later. As British personnel surrounded the FW-190 and Faber, measuring tapes and notebooks at the ready, the stage was set for an unprecedented intelligence coup. This single pilot, trained to excel at precision and survival, had become the unwitting architect of a turning point in the air war over Europe. And yet, this was only the beginning. The skies over the Bristol Channel that morning were deceptively calm. A pale sunlight filtered through fragmented clouds, casting the Welsh countryside in muted green and grey. To anyone on the ground, it was ordinary. To Oberleutnant Armin Faber, it was a landscape that betrayed his senses. Faber had been trained to read the sky like a map, to anticipate every landmark, every coastline, every subtle change in terrain. But war is a cruel teacher. Clouds, high-speed maneuvers, and the glare of the sun had conspired to erase the borders between enemy and ally. He believed he was over northern France, returning to a Luftwaffe base. In reality, he had drifted nearly 200 miles north. The pilots who flew with him later described this kind of disorientation as common but dangerous. High-altitude dogfights, rapid climbs and dives, and high G-forces can starve the brain of oxygen, leaving even the most experienced aviators confused. For Faber, those conditions created a perfect storm. He had broken through a layer of clouds, and below him stretched rolling green fields punctuated by hangars and taxiways. His mind filled in the gaps: friendly airfield, familiar formations, a safe landing awaiting him. He began his descent. The thrum of the BMW 801 engine was steady and confident, a reassurance that the machine responded perfectly to his every input. He reduced speed, flaps extended, and the aircraft glided toward the runway with uncanny smoothness. In his mind, this was routine. Nothing in his training suggested that anything could go wrong. On the ground, RAF personnel were just as shocked as he was oblivious. Guards froze, tools slipped from hands, and a mechanic whispered to a colleague, "Is that a Focke-Wulf on our runway?" The wheels touched the damp grass, rolling forward with precise control. Faber opened his canopy, expecting the sight of gray uniforms, the familiar insignia of his comrades. Instead, he saw blue jackets, rifles, and astonished faces. Panic briefly flashed across his mind. Then training kicked in. He tried to restart the engine, to take off again, to regain control. But it was too late. British airmen quickly surrounded the aircraft, cutting off any chance of escape. Every attempt to maneuver or taxi was blocked. Within minutes, Armin Faber was in custody, a seasoned ace rendered powerless by geography, weather, and a simple navigational error. The paradox was clear. One of Germany's deadliest pilots, flying one of the most advanced fighters of the era, had been captured without a single shot fired. The FW-190, the plane that had dominated Allied airspace for months, now rested intact in enemy hands. British intelligence officers immediately recognized the significance. The RAF command at Pembrey moved with a combination of disbelief and urgency. Air Chief Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas ordered the fighter transported at once to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Engineers, test pilots, and intelligence officers would examine every inch of the aircraft. Every bolt, every panel, every control was a puzzle piece to a larger mystery. What made this machine superior, and how could its secrets be used to reclaim the skies? The FW-190 was now more than a weapon. It was a Rosetta Stone of aerial warfare. Allied pilots, who had feared it as a phantom menace, could now study its form, its engine, and its weapon systems. The very aircraft that had caused RAF fighter losses to spike dramatically. Nearly 200 pilots killed in the first half of 1942 over France was about to reveal its vulnerabilities. And yet, the scene remained almost cinematic in its absurdity. A fighter designed for precision, delivered by fate and confusion. A pilot trained to survive, rendered powerless by a misread coastline. One airfield in Wales became the center of a strategic turning point that no one could have predicted. From the skies to the ground, the lesson was immediate. Even the most advanced technology is only as invincible as the human controlling it. And for the Allies, the chance to understand the FW-190's strengths and weaknesses had finally arrived. Courtesy of the wrong coastline, by the time the FW-190 arrived at Farnborough, the atmosphere was electric. British engineers, test pilots, and intelligence officers moved through the hangars with a mix of reverence and disbelief. Here was Germany's most feared fighter, undamaged, intact, and ready for examination. The significance was almost overwhelming. For months, Allied pilots had described the plane in fragments, accounts of incredible speed, devastating firepower, and maneuverability that seemed to defy physics. Now, finally, the reports could be verified, measured, and understood. Every inch of the aircraft was meticulously documented. Captain Eric Brown, one of Britain's foremost test pilots, would later describe the experience as walking into a living textbook of aerial combat. He ran his hands along the fuselage, feeling the subtle contours that allowed the plane to cut through the air with terrifying efficiency. The radial BMW 801D engine alone produced 1,700 horsepower, a clear advantage over the Spitfire's Merlin engine, which delivered roughly 1,470 horsepower. But the raw numbers were only the beginning. Engineers quickly discovered what pilots had already sensed in battle. The FW-190's roll rate was extraordinary. In the air, it could snap from one bank to another, faster than any Allied fighter could respond. Test pilot notes emphasized the light, almost thought-driven control of the ailerons. Where the Spitfire required constant muscle and finesse, the FW-190 responded instantly to the pilot's intent, almost as if the plane anticipated each maneuver. In dogfights, this allowed German pilots to gain the angle of attack before their opponents even realized the turn had begun. The plane's armament further underscored its dominance. Mounted close to the fuselage were four 20mm MG 151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. In combat, a 2-second burst delivered more explosive power than a Spitfire could generate in 10 seconds. British engineers measured the tight concentration pattern of the weapons, recognizing the lethal efficiency at close range. The FW-190 was a flying calculation of firepower, speed, and maneuverability, each component tuned to devastating effect. Yet, Farnborough's engineers were equally attuned to vulnerabilities. Testing revealed the radial engine struggled at high altitudes, above 20,000 feet. Cooling problems and a drop in performance created a clear limitation. The aircraft's heavier weight, while advantageous for diving attacks, reduced sustained turning performance. Allied pilots now had the insight to force a FW-190 into engagements where its strengths could be mitigated and its weaknesses exploited. Every measurement, every test flight was documented with a precision that would have immediate operational impact. The British realized that tactical knowledge, more than brute force, would decide the sky. Fighter squadrons could now plan not just where to fly, but how to fight, based on empirical data rather than anecdote. The intelligence value extended far beyond Britain. By August 1942, American test pilots arrived at Farnborough to fly the captured fighter. They dissected every aspect: control sensitivity, engine limits, weapon targeting, gaining a tactical playbook for future combat in Europe. One American officer reported bluntly, "Above 25,000 feet we have the edge. Below that, the FW-190 dominates. Know the terrain, know the altitude, and you control the fight." This single aircraft, brought down not by bullets, but by a pilot's disorientation, became the blueprint for Allied aerial strategy. Engineers analyzed cockpit layout, weapon positioning, and aerodynamics. Pilots rehearsed maneuvers and learned to exploit moments of vulnerability, particularly the heavy control response at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour in dives. By the time the FW-190 was returned to operational testing, Allied forces had turned the aircraft's design, previously an instrument of fear, into a teaching tool. RAF and USAF pilots could now approach combat with confidence rather than trepidation. Every engineer, every pilot, every tactical bulletin issued over the following months traced back to that one serendipitous landing at Pembrey, where the impossible had become reality. And yet, the paradox remained. A machine built to dominate, brought into the hands of the enemy by simple human error, would alter the trajectory of the war in ways no designer could have imagined. Once the FW-190 was in Allied hands, the task was clear: understand it, master it, and turn its advantages against the Germans. What had been a terrifying specter over the Channel became a laboratory in the open air, where the secrets of the aircraft could be probed, tested, and recorded. Every panel removed, every instrument measured, and every flight taken revealed insights that had been hidden in plain sight. British test pilots were the first to climb into the cockpit. Captain Eric Brown described the sensation of taking control of the machine. "The plane responded before I even moved my hands. It was as if it anticipated my every thought. The ailerons were light and precise, allowing rolling maneuvers faster than any Spitfire could match." In combat, this meant that a German pilot could reverse direction line up a shot, and escape before an Allied pilot even realized what was happening. The firepower was equally shocking. The MG-151 cannons delivered a destructive force far beyond the standard Allied armament of the time. A concentrated 2-second burst could obliterate a Spitfire, leaving debris trailing through the sky. Engineers meticulously measured trajectory, firing arcs, and recoil, creating diagrams and data tables that would be circulated to RAF squadrons. Even the placement of the weapons in the wings, close to the fuselage, was deliberate, concentrating impact and increasing lethality. Yet, for every strength discovered, a weakness emerged. Tests showed that the FW-190's radial engine suffered at high altitudes, losing power above 20,000 feet. While devastating at low and medium levels, the aircraft could not sustain the same advantage in the thin air above. Engineers and pilots realized that altitude would become a tactical equalizer, and soon fighter doctrine would be rewritten around this insight. American pilots arrived in August 1942, ready to fly the captured fighter and absorb every detail. Major Cass Hoover, one of the first USAAF pilots to test the aircraft, wrote a blunt assessment in his report. Below 20,000 feet, the FW-190 dominates. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and Spitfires have the edge. The fight is about altitude, control, and timing, not bravery alone. This intelligence fundamentally reshaped the approach of Allied air forces. Tactics, training, and even aircraft design began to incorporate lessons learned from the FW-190, P-47, Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang pilots trained to climb aggressively, forcing German fighters into high-altitude environments where their engines faltered. Dogfighting strategies emphasized sustained turning engagements, exploiting the FW-190's limitations in prolonged horizontal maneuvers. Testing also revealed a subtle but critical flaw. At high speeds, exceeding 400 miles per hour, the aircraft's controls became extremely heavy, requiring significant strength to pull out of a dive. This moment of vulnerability, fleeting but decisive, could be exploited by an experienced pilot who knew the machine's quirks. Every Allied squadron received tactical bulletins, diagrams, and demonstration flights, ensuring that the knowledge gained from Faber's accidental gift reached the front line. The FW-190 became a teacher, revealing the intricate balance of speed, firepower, and maneuverability. Pilots and engineers alike recognized that the plane was not invincible. It was a product of clever design with specific strengths and exploitable weaknesses. By decoding the aircraft, the Allies turned fear into preparation and uncertainty into strategy. The psychological impact was just as significant as the technical one. Pilots who had previously dreaded the appearance of a butcher bird could now approach combat with confidence. They understood where to engage, when to withdraw, and how to exploit the aircraft's limitations. The FW-190, once a ghost haunting the Channel skies, had been rendered tangible, knowable, and defeatable. In effect, the plane had shifted from being an instrument of terror to a blueprint for victory. The intelligence extracted from its design would ripple through every Allied fighter command, informing tactical decisions, pilot training, and aircraft development. And it all stemmed from one simple miscalculation. One pilot landing on the wrong coastline, unaware that he was delivering Germany's most lethal secret directly into enemy hands. The intelligence extracted from Faber's FW-190 did more than satisfy curiosity. It reshaped the air war over Europe. By late 1942, the Allies were no longer scrambling blindly against a seemingly invincible foe. They had knowledge, and with knowledge came strategy. Every Allied pilot who climbed into the cockpit of a Spitfire or a P-47 now carried with them the insights gleaned from an aircraft that had once seemed untouchable. Tactics changed almost immediately. Bomber escort missions were altered to exploit altitude advantages. Spitfire Memoir 9s and P-47's Thunderbolts were trained to climb aggressively to above 25,000 feet, where the FW-190's BMW radial engine began to falter. Low-altitude dogfights, once a guaranteed disaster, were avoided whenever possible. Pilots were no longer simply reacting to the FW-190. They were dictating the terms of engagement. American fighter groups played a particularly crucial role. The P-47, with its turbo-supercharged engine, excelled at high altitudes. Pilots used the aircraft to force engagements where the German planes were disadvantaged. Every climb, dive, and maneuver reflected lessons learned directly from the captured fighter. One USAAF report bluntly stated, "Let them dictate low-altitude combat, and we die. Force them high, and we win." The tactical advantage didn't stop at altitude. Engineers applied insights from the FW-190's roll rate and control sensitivity to modifications in American aircraft. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 saw improved aileron responsiveness, tighter cockpit layouts, and weapons concentration that mirrored the German design philosophy. Allied aircraft became not only faster and more maneuverable but smarter, built to exploit enemy weaknesses rather than merely match raw power. Even psychologically, the captured FW-190 shifted perceptions. Allied pilots, who had once approached each sortie with fear and respect for the butcher bird, now understood that the plane had limitations. Fear turned into calculated caution, and hesitation turned into confidence. RAF records from early 1943 show a noticeable change in engagement behavior. Pilots who had once attempted risky turns to outroll the FW-190 now forced it into prolonged horizontal turns, exploiting its weaker sustained turning performance. The results were measurable. By mid-1943, kill ratios began to shift in the Allies' favor. FW-190 losses increased steadily as German pilots realized that Allied fighters were no longer making the tactical errors that had allowed the aircraft to dominate the previous year. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, a high-scoring German ace, noted in his combat journal, "The Americans have studied the aircraft. They do not follow us into rolling scissors. They force us high where our engines labor. They have learned the captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the war, serving as a reference aircraft for evaluating new German variants. When the FW-190D9 Dora appeared in late 1944 with its inline engine, Allied engineers could immediately compare it to Faber's aircraft, understanding how the Germans had addressed previous weaknesses. This continuous reference allowed pilots and engineers to stay one step ahead, turning Germany's technological edge into a tactical blueprint for counterattack. The irony was undeniable. A machine that had once caused panic and fear among the Allies became the foundation for their dominance in the skies. One aircraft, delivered by human error, had shifted the balance of power. Strategic advantage, intelligence, and tactical knowledge had replaced uncertainty, creating conditions where Allied forces could fight with precision rather than desperation. Faber's personal fate mirrored the plane's transformation. Captured and sent to a POW camp in Canada, he survived the war, witnessing the aircraft he had piloted become a tool that would guide thousands of Allied pilots to survival and victory. His disorientation had inadvertently rewritten the rules of aerial combat over Europe. In the vast theater of war, the FW-190 was no longer just a weapon. It was a lesson in innovation, intelligence, and the fragility of perceived invincibility. And it all began with one wrong coastline. By late 1943, the FW-190 had lost much of its aura of invincibility. The Allies, armed with knowledge gleaned from Faber's accidental gift, had transformed fear into mastery. Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts patrolled the skies with confidence rooted in intelligence, not guesswork. The very tactics that had once left Allied pilots vulnerable were now turned against their former tormentors. Pilots forced engagements to high altitudes, exploiting engine limitations, or used prolonged turning fights to counter the devastating roll rate of the German fighter. Every encounter reflected lessons distilled from careful study, meticulous testing, and strategic application. American and British engineers continued to mine the FW-190 for insights. Cockpit layouts influenced the design of next-generation Allied aircraft, while weapon placement inspired more concentrated, lethal firing patterns. The roll rate advantage, once exclusive to the Luftwaffe, was analyzed, modeled, and integrated into modifications on P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. Training programs incorporated these lessons, creating pilots who could anticipate the capabilities of their adversaries and act preemptively rather than reactively. What had been an instrument of fear became a teaching tool for survival and victory. The broader impact on the air war was profound. By mid-1944, Allied pilots dominated skies where they had once been hunted. FW-190 losses climbed as German pilots realized their advantages were no longer secret. Strategic air operations, bomber escorts, fighter sweeps, and ground support missions now relied on data-driven tactics derived directly from the intelligence gathered at Farnborough. The skies of Europe had shifted from a realm of uncertainty to a domain shaped by knowledge and foresight. The paradox of Faber's mistake remained vivid in historical accounts. A single human error had delivered Germany's deadliest fighter intact into Allied hands. What seemed a catastrophic failure for the Luftwaffe had, in reality, changed the course of aerial warfare. Captain Eric Brown, who had flown more captured enemy aircraft than anyone else, later reflected, "Faber's navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design. Every advantage the FW-190 possessed was documented, and every weakness was exploited. That one aircraft probably saved more Allied lives than any intelligence coup of the war." Even decades later, aviation historians emphasized the FW-190's dual legacy, a marvel of engineering and a case study in the power of intelligence over technology. Museums around the world display surviving examples as testaments to German innovation, but every exhibit notes the irony. The plane's dominance was undone not by superior Allied aircraft, but by knowledge gained from an accident. In this, the story transcends technology. It is about human perception, error, and the unforeseen consequences that ripple through history. Armin Faber himself returned to Germany after the war, living quietly until 1976. Records suggest he was initially blamed for the loss of the aircraft, though later assessments acknowledge that even the most skilled pilots could fall victim to combat disorientation. His personal narrative mirrors the paradox of the FW-190 itself, a figure associated with fear and destruction whose unintended action became a conduit for learning, strategy, and ultimately victory. In the end, the story of the FW-190 captures the fragile balance of warfare. Technology can dominate, but intelligence guides victory. Germany's secret fighter, once a phantom in the skies, became a teacher, a blueprint, and a pivot point in the Allied strategy. One pilot's disorientation, one wrong coastline, one intact aircraft. These small events produced consequences that extended far beyond the airfield in Wales. The paradox echoes as a lesson across time. The most formidable weapon is not always the one built with power or precision, but the one whose secrets can be understood, adapted, and applied by those who seek knowledge. The skies of Europe were changed, lives were saved, and the course of history subtly but decisively shifted, all because of one human error that revealed what had once seemed invincible.